Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of Magic Gametime. I'm just going to do this once a week as well, and I'm going to highlight one of the decks that you see played in the Magic Gametime that you see each week. I'm going to start off here with my lands. I'm running 16 planes, and then you'll see 2 copies of Emeria the Sky Ruin and 2 copies of Mystifying Maze. Every land in this deck is in this deck for a specific purpose, so I'm not going to get too much into the special lands right now, but if you're wondering why I'm not running any cracked lands, for example, like Arid Mesa, it's because to get to 7 planes, I personally feel like I need to kind of draw into them and not fix them out of the library, because if I take out 4 planes for 4 mesas, I'm down to 12 planes and you need 7 for Emeria to get off. But they're more in the deck for each of their own specific purposes, so I'll move them over to where they are relevant, and we'll get back to them in a second. That's probably the most awkward way I could have moved them. Going straight down from the lands, I'm going to move into my 1-drops. My 1-drops in the deck, I have 2 copies of Caravan Escort and 2 copies of Student of Warfare. Truthfully, I'm going to admit right off the top that Student of Warfare is vastly superior in a mono-white deck. Caravan Escort's mainly in there for variety, and also in the event that my opening hand contains like a Plains and a Mystifying Maze, I can at least level the Escort up to 2 on turn 2 if I don't have a better play. It's something. It's not great. In fact, Caravan Escort's much better as a late game card than anything, and even then it's fairly lackluster. It's pretty much a 5/5 for 11. So, like I said, most likely more Student of Warfare is probably better, but I do have 2 of each in the base deck. Moving down to the most important part of my deck, my 2 and 3s. I have 4 copies of White Knight and 4 copies of Knight Exemplar, and these are pretty much the glue that hold the deck together. White Knight might be one of the best 2-mana aggro creatures ever printed, because I pay 2 mana and I get a 2/2 with First Strike and Pro Black, which for 2 mana is ridiculous. Knight Exemplar, obviously, the big factor in the deck here, because it gives all my knights +1/+1 and indestructible. If I get one turn 3 and turn 4, which is the typical way that this deck will play, even though it has other 4-drops, if you Exemplar turn 3 and Exemplar turn 4, the game changes very, very dramatically. Moving over into my 4s, I have 2 copies of Hero of Bladehold and 2 copies of Kabira Vindicator. Honestly, the deck doesn't really need the Vindicators at all. I have other ways of pumping my creatures, and it's kind of overcosted for what you get for it. So truthfully, the best thing would almost be to take these 2 out and probably place a 3rd hero in the deck, and then a 3rd of another card in the deck that I'll get to in a second. The Vindicators don't really have a lot of places in this deck, although they do work as an adequate 4-drop. Okay, so that's the main core of the deck, would be those 8 cards there. Now, of course, outside of the core, then you have to start getting into the support of this deck, and a deck like this really needs support for a lot of things. It's pretty much just a white creature aggro deck. So we're going to move on to power, protection, effectiveness. I'm going to start with the equipment, and I've also got 2 copies of Core Outfitter over here. I'm running 2 copies of Ogre's Cleaver and 4 copies of Basilisk's Collar. Basilisk's Collar is the prototypical, makes this deck incredibly more effective than it looks, because it gives a creature Death Touch and Lifelink, so if I put it on one of my knights, I will strike first and instantly kill you and gain life off of it. So it's pretty important for them to be in the deck. Now, the Cleavers and the Core Outfitter are an interesting decision here. I did it mostly for kind of protective reasons. It gives me creatures with like 7 and First Strike, but a lot of people will point out that's probably not the most effective combo to use. It was mostly done for effectiveness and, like I said, protection against big creatures as another option. Honestly, it's another set of cards that possibly could be phased out if I was really looking to improve the deck at this point. but they were in the deck for a while, and it does actually turn out to be very effective if you can actually use them appropriately. Even a 4-mana turn where you drop Ogre's Cleaver, then drop the Outfitter, can completely change the face of the game, especially if you already have an Exemplar and a White Knight out, or 2 Exemplars out. Well, Exemplar and a White Knight, because it'd be turn 4, but you could do lots of stuff with that, and it's like if you're in a really, really good curve, it could be just as simple as Student of Warfare turn 1, Ogre's Cleaver, or White Knight turn 2, Exemplar turn 3, Cleaver Outfitter turn 4, and then you've got an 8-3 Student of Warfare, or a 7-2 White Knight, or a 7-2 Exemplar. And my math's off a little bit there, because I forgot to add the +1s from the Exemplars, but you get the picture. What's the other problem that this deck faces? Well, this deck is an aggro deck, so the other thing that can really, really get irritating is your opponent's creatures. Now, white doesn't really have a lot of frontal, forward, aggro kind of removal cards. The best, in my opinion, for all of white is Pacifism, which I'm running 3 copies of. The rest of it's all defensive for when I'm playing really, really big. While the deck is an aggro deck and does run incredibly well as an aggro deck, it also runs very well as a defensive, creature-based white deck. Basilisk Collar, First Strike, 3 copies of Smite, 2 copies of Pitfall Trap, and then we get into my really big control, 2 copies of Mystifying Maze, which I mentioned earlier with my lands. Its secondary ability can be absolutely critical against a lot of decks, especially decks that are very flying heavy, which this deck really can't respond to particularly well. World Queller is a control card first and foremost. If I get caught in a long, dragged-out battle, it essentially lets me to completely change the pace of the game. The other problem that this deck really faces is spot removal, so we'll move up to the top here. As we established, I have my 2 copies of Emiria. I also run 2 copies of Marshall's Anthem, which is officially a 6-drop that allows me to return a creature, and 2 copies of Sun Titan, which is a 6-drop that allows me to return a creature, so they pretty much play the same purpose in the deck, although preferably I'd like to get out the Sun Titan, which should be a giant knight, but isn't. And then last but not least, the 2 missing spots, I have 2 copies of Ornithopter. When I moved the Kabira Vindicator earlier, I put a 3rd one up here. It's essentially basic, no-cost protection against flying. And also I have had a couple games go my favor because it's been turn 1, Thopter, turn 2, Ogre's Cleaver, turn 3, Core Outfitter, I swing for 5 in the air. It's not a perfect card by any means, but all of the appropriately thematic flying creatures, not the best. You would probably see these, like I said, in more numbers, probably at least 3 of them, if I was to do an overhaul of the deck at this point. My big concern with overhauling the deck at this point is it is phasing out in September, so if you guys do want to play this deck or a variant of this deck, do be aware it is phasing out in September, so make sure you get your stuff as soon as you can. So that is the entire deck. It doesn't have a sideboard at this time. If anybody has any suggestions for a sideboard, I'm more than willing to hear them. And that is Magic Decktime for week 2. There wasn't one for week 1. Sorry about that, guys. Magic Decktime for week 2. And that is the White Knights deck.